finish in towards the end. So go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, sounds good. So for anyone who hasn't heard about our project or heard us give one of these presentations, we'll just start with some kind of broad overview of what we're doing and then some of the data that we generated last year. So you want to go forward one slide. So just generally some of the opportunities and challenges of the perennial flax breeding program. We're looking on the opportunity side at oilseed, fiber, and ornamental cut flower uses of perennial flax. We think this could be a great year-round green cover for the state of Minnesota. There are a couple other advantages that flax brings. It tends to have either multiple cycles of flowering or it'll just flower continuously throughout the year. We're seeing this year that we can get multiple harvests per year on our oilseed lines. And you know, in summary, there's a lot of potential for this crop. Flax is one of these traditional, it's throughout history been a really common multi-use crop, both for fiber and for seed production. And so we think the same thing applies to perennial flax. It's got many of these quality traits. So the potential is expansive yet unknown in summary. On the challenges side though, we do see some issues with whether or not these are true perennials. We've found some in the field that where the stand seems to only last 2 years, but we did get regrowth in that third year for some of the lines. So that's going to be one of the big issues to play out over the next several years, is making sure that we're selecting true perennial lines. There are classic crop domestication issues from the standpoint of oilseed production, like shattering and small seed size. These are typical things that you would expect in a wild crop. And then on the cut flower side, one of the main barriers is this issue of flower holding capacity. And so this basically refers to the propensity of flax to drop its petals once a day. So new flowers open every day, but they also drop off towards the latter half of the day in the late afternoon. So we're looking at variation in this trait, trying to select lines that can hold onto those petals for longer to increase their cut flower potential. And then a couple other things at the end are just plant stature. We get some of these wild types that tend to just lay kind of flat on the ground or have sort of a messy growth habit. So we're trying to standardize that into a more upright, uniform shape. And then, of course, selecting for yield and seed quality. So next slide, please. Now, just to give some background on what's already out there on the market, we were not the first people to do perennial flax breeding. There are a couple of historical examples, but the most relevant one is the work that was done by the USDA. They were breeding lines, I believe, for forage use and land reclamation. There are two basically releases that came out of that program. The first was APAR, which is kind of a funny story in and of itself. It was released as a Linum lewisii, which is our native flax here in North America, but it was later found to be actually of European descent, the species Linum peren. So that's an open pollinated line. And then the second one is Maple Grove. This was actually confirmed to be a Linum lewisii. So this is kind of the USDA's attempt at making right on their mistaken release of APAR as a native line, or as a native variety. So both of these came from the USDA originally. There are a couple ornamental flaxes out there, both Linum perenni. These are sapphire and blue flax, which you can see pictures of on the right. And that's kind of, you know, one big takeaway of these ornamental lines is they have good winter survival in Minnesota. The foliage looks all right, but they really just don't have any flower power. The flowering period is short and they don't produce many blooms. So as far as our competition on the ornamental side, it's not great. It's kind of a low bar to get across, which is good for us. So if you go to the next slide. Okay, so just to review some of what we've done already. In 2019, we planted a number of sites. We had our top selections out at Morris, Grand Rapids, and then also Rosemont, St. Paul, and a really far away site at West Virginia State University. And at each of these, we put our top 10 perennial oilseed and perennial ornamental types. Rosemont was our main nursery, and in this, we basically did a wide evaluation since we didn't know which species would be the most optimal for our breeding program. So we looked at 18 different wild species of flax. The genus itself is really large. It contains about 200 species. So this was even just a very small subset of what we found, what we thought would be the most promising, and then also what we could get our hands on, because many of those species are just unavailable. And out of that, we made advanced perennial selections for oilseed and ornamental types and collected a range of different forms of data on flowering and seed traits. So you can go to the next slide. So this is just a list of our species that we evaluated. For those who have seen us talk before, you've seen this list, but we just wanted to update with some of the results of that evaluation. So if we go to the next slide, this is basically what we've narrowed it down to. Our top 3 perennial species that we're looking at are up at the top left: Linum austriacum, Linum lewisii, and Linum peren. Those are all blue-flowered perennial flaxes. There's another blue-flowered perennial at the bottom right, Linum narbonense, but unfortunately the seed availability for that one is really poor. There just isn't a lot out there that we can get our hands on. So maybe something to evaluate in the future, but for now it's kind of off to the side. And then in addition to that, a couple other species that we still include in our evaluations are Linum grandiflorum and Linum alatum, which are both annuals, as well as Linum flavum and Linum hirsutum, which are perennials, but definitely don't warrant as much evaluation. They just don't have as much potential, we think, at this point. Next slide, please. All right, so to really focus in on these top 3 perennials that we're evaluating, they're all very similar, and this slide is just to illustrate really the only morphological differences between them. So Linum austriacum is characterized by this deflexed pedicel, or a drooping pedicel, I guess you could say. You can see that on the right, whereas Linum peren and lewisii have these really upright pedicels. And then even further, the only difference between Linum peren and Linum lewisii is the mating system. So Linum peren has 2 different flower morphs. It's distylous, so there are these long-styled and short-styled types, and the only way that you can get a compatible cross is to have a long-styled cross with a short-styled flower. Linum lewisii, all the flowers are long-styled, and they are self-compatible. So that's one advantage of that species. But in terms of morphology, if we go to the next slide, you can see a picture of our nursery. This is all the species intermixed, and you can see that they all look very similar. There's not, when you're looking at it from above, there's not much difference in plant habit. Go to the next slide. Okay, so I just want to get into some of the data from 2019. So in this, our main goals were to compare these 3 main species for a number of traits that we're interested in. So if we're looking at some of our ornamental traits, like numbers of weeks in flower and flower diameter, we look at Linum austriacum. That performed generally the best of all these perennial species. It had the longest flowering time, and for many of these ornamentals, what we're going for is that sort of continuous flowering to maximize our pollinator services. Flower diameter is kind of interesting. So Linum lewisii had the largest flowers, and you could easily see this when you're walking through the field, but they just didn't have as much vigor in terms of their growth habit. And this is kind of reflected in number of weeks in flower. So we saw a much more limited flowering window. On a promising note, our oilseed selections and our cut flower selections from 2019 averaged above the board in terms of their time in bloom. Their flower diameter is pretty comparable to Linum austriacum or Linum peren, so that has room for improvement. But we were happy to see that they had a prolonged flowering period. Next slide, please. We also saw a range of flower colors. The yellow and red are those annual species, which I mentioned earlier, but you can even see within the blue flowered perennials, there are a range of different blues, purples, ranging to almost pure white. And we even have one line that does have pure white flowers. So it's quite a range visually in the field. Next slide, please. And then finally, in 2019, we also did a vase life study comparing these 3 main species for their overall vase life, and then a number of other traits relevant to cut flower production. So we'll just take a look at 2 of those here today. Overall vase life, we can see that treatment was the most significant factor in the study by far. It was highly significant for all the species involved. You can see on the table that floral preservative consistently prolonged the vase life by 1 to 2 days. It also increased the average number of flowers quite substantially, in some cases 2 to 3 times. And species was also significant, but less so. So we can see differences between the species. Linum lewisii was consistently lower compared to some of these other species, which ranged closer to 9 to 10 days. Next slide, please. And then finally, looking at some yield data from last year, getting into our oilseed objectives. In this case, very similar to number of weeks in flower, the oilseed and cut flower selections generally performed better than any of the wild accessions that we evaluated. Linum austriacum was pretty promising, just coming straight out of those USDA accessions with an average yield of 1.42. And this is in year 1 too, so these yields, keep in mind, are a lot lower than what we saw in year 2. 1,000 seed weight also had a range from generally like 1.1 to 1.5 was typical for what we'd see for these perennial lines. And then one thing to point out here, so I had on the earlier slide, this species, Linum usidatissimum. This is domesticated annual flax and serves as sort of our check line, comparing to our domesticated flax, which you can find in the grocery store and things like that. But one thing to note when we evaluated this on a space plant in the space planted nursery, the per plant yield was really low. And so it's kind of important to note that in the future, we'll only be using this when we do plot-based evaluations of yield, because that domesticated flax is not meant to be planted in a space planted nursery. It's meant to be seeded at a high rate. So these numbers are, I guess, just take it with a grain of salt, because this is not the typical environment that you would see that grown in. All right, next slide, please. And then we also did our first comparison of year 1 and year 2 yield in 2019. This was done at a nursery that was established by our agronomist, Kevin Betts, before I arrived. So in 2018, if you look at that table on the right, those year 1 yields are quite a bit lower than the yields that we got in 2019 from year 1 plants, which you can compare. That's a table on the left with Forage Hill. And that was because those were probably harvested a little bit late. But even if you compare the Forage Hill year 1 yield to what we saw in year 2 in this gravel pit nursery that Kevin established, across the board, those year 2 yields were a lot higher compared to year 1, which seems to be pretty typical for these perennial grain crops. So next slide, please. This graph is just comparing those year 1 and year 2 yields from that gravel pit site. We were basically trying to look at whether or not there was any really clear trend between year 1 and year 2 yields. On the right side of this graph, where you get these really high year 2 yields, there are more peaks in the year 1 yield, so there might be a little bit of a trend there, but we also do see some peaks down the lower end. So not quite sure what the correlation is yet between those, but one of our main objectives is definitely going to be to increase that year 1 vigor, get those year 1 yields up so that as soon as you put this crop on the landscape, you're going to get a viable amount of seed that you can sell. Next slide, please. All right, I'm moving on to what we've been doing this year. So we continued making selections on yield and seed size for all of our main perennial species. So we took the 10 highest yielding year 1 perennials and 5 highest year 2 perennials. And then we also made some ornamental selections, so selected on flower diameter and flower longevity. And then we also had a couple of those annual lines included in this as well. So these were sown in the nursery in a mist house and transplanted to the field. So these were going into our space planted nursery for initial evaluations, basically. Next slide, please. We also planted 3 sites of a seed increase this year. These were direct sown, so this is the first time that we've, at least that I've done direct sowing of flax. In the past, we've done everything from transplants. So this is getting much more into, you know, the typical agronomic setting of oilseed flax, and so we're going to want to move this direction more and more in the future. And one thing to note from that we've immediately realized from this experiment is that the flax plants are not very vigorous from seed. You can look at our stand counts, and there was a ton of variation between these sites, and overall the establishment was not very good. So those are average stand counts for each genotype, and I think each genotype had something like I want to say it's like a 15 or a 20 foot row. I'd have to check specifically, but you know, overall not a lot of plants came up. So vigor from direct seeding is going to be another big issue to work on for these oilseed lines moving forward. But we'll have to see how these stands do in year 2. Again, those year 2 plants are so much more vigorous, so I could see, even though the plants were pretty weak this year, I don't think we're going to get much seed off of them. We still might be able to get some of the better ones next year harvested and then sort of redo this experiment. Next slide, please. Another exciting find from this year was just how early these plants emerged and started to flower again. So you can see in the left, this was a picture taken on April 10th, and they already had quite an established crown going. These are year 2 plants. And again, in May 5th, just under a month later, many of these plants were already beginning to flower. And the next slide, look at the next slide, we can see that there are already pollinators on these plants as early as May 5th. So some of the earliest bees we saw out and about in our nursery, and there wasn't really much else out there at the time. So this is a good sign for one of our objectives, which is to use these plants to provide pollinator services to the Minnesota landscape. So with this early flowering, long flowering period throughout the summer, and then they also continue flowering late into the fall. They'll probably keep flowering until almost November, sometimes into November for the really late lines. So this really is great as it creates a really big window for pollinators to have forage on the landscape. Next slide, please. All right, another thing that we confirmed this year was the 2 times per year harvest. Prior to this year, we had heard that this might be possible, and there were some observations that, you know, we were thinking that we would be able to do this, but we hadn't actually been able to put it into practice. But this year, across the board, we've had tons of plants that are giving us a second yield. We harvested them the first time early in July, and they're just about ready to harvest again now. So we'll be doing that over the next couple of weeks, which should really help boost our yields in year 2. Next slide, please. So this slide here was some of our top selections, which were planted in St. Paul, and then we saw the same thing in Rosemont, even with some of the accessions that were planted directly from the USDA without any selection done by us. So that was good to see that many of these plants, even in their wild state, can provide 2 harvests per year, at least in that second year of growth. Next slide, please. All right, and then to close up this year, we have continued with making visual selections. So these have been based on all sorts of traits, mostly ornamental value, uniform growth habit, upright growth habit, as you can see in that picture on the bottom. And then we've also made selections based on regrowth potential, early maturity, flower holding capacity, and also unique traits like we see sometimes this petal dot, which you can see in the top image. And then upcoming this fall, we'll be making selection again on seed traits, mostly based on yield, seed size, and then also looking for lines which have a higher yield in year 1 and year 2. So that'll be upcoming in the spring. Hopefully we can provide more information then. Next slide, please. All right, and then I just wanted to close out my section of the presentation by talking about some of our top selections that we're trying to rapidly move towards variety release, at least on the ornamental side. So the most promising of these is this oilseed garden selection. This was a really, by and large, our top plant in terms of its year 2 growth habit. It forms these really nice cushion-shaped rows, absolutely covered in blooms. This is an image taken midsummer in our St. Paul nursery. And it's so far continued flowering year long. Even after harvesting, it came back really quick and started flowering again. And we think it might have good seed set as well. But we're trying to push this out as an ornamental variety as quickly as possible. And so one of our ways that we're approaching that on the next slide is through this All-American selection trial. So Neil may be able to chime in on this later on if he wants, because I'm sure has more experience with this than I do, but it's basically a nationwide trial. We're sending out cuttings that are going to be evaluated at 50 plus field sites across the nation. And the winner of the All-American selection trials, if it does beat out the existing cultivars of perennial flax on the market, it's more or less going to guarantee us sales on the variety, which would be really exciting. So fingers are crossed, we're getting that going this winter, and we'll be sending out those cuttings in December and January for that trial, which will happen over next summer. So that's
yeah,
the
this
main
is a
thing.
really prestigious trial, that's for sure. And if you have an All-America selection winner, and maybe you've had some before, bought some vegetables or flowers that have AAS on them as winners, they're guaranteed performers across the country. So if it does win an award, it'll be great. This is a 3-year trial, by the way. It's not just 1 year. So we'll see how they do in over 3 years.
Yep. And then the next slides, they'll just go over some of our other top selections. This is our current top selection for cut flower habit. It's shown really great winter survival across zone 3 and 4 in Minnesota. Really upright stems, again, flowering all year long. The plants themselves aren't quite as big as the previous selection I showed you, but so far it's looking really promising for cut flower production. And then if you go to the next slide, we have, oh yeah, so this is our top selection right now for flower holding potential. In 2019, we identified this plant that holds its flowers really late into the afternoon, sometimes between 4 and 6 p.m. It'll still have flowers on the plant, which is pretty unusual for flax. We see most of these plants dropping their flowers really around like noon, 1 p.m. So typically if you go out in the nursery in the afternoon, what you'll see is just a bunch of green plants, green foliage and no flowers. But this one, it really stands out in that it holds its flowers late into the day. So we think it shows promise from the cut flower side of things. And the next slide just shows this plant, what it looked like in year 2. This is really great to see. The plant came back really vigorous and really was pretty good, very showy in year 2. So I don't know if this one will be quite ready for variety release, but we'll definitely be using it in crosses this winter, which will be performing in the greenhouse. And if we go to the last slide, from my part, it's just one of our other ornamental selections. We had an industry member from a propagator out. You'll have to remind me what town is from, Jane Roberts.
It's Walter's Gardens from Zeeland, Michigan.
Got it. Okay, so yeah, she was out here looking at our plants, and this is one of the lines that really caught her eye for its super dense foliage. And this one we found really effective at weed suppression. The entire summer that I was taking care of this nursery and keeping the weeds down, I really didn't have to worry much about this one, which is pretty promising given that flax, one of the big issues, even in the domesticated varieties of flax, is weed control. The really thin, kind of wispy foliage of flax is just doesn't do well to shade out the weeds. So this line stands out in that regard, and that it really creates a nice shaded cover, shaded canopy that keeps those weeds down. It's not quite as floriferous as some of our other selections, but we think that it's a great one for crosses as well. And with that, I think that wraps up my part of the presentation. Neil,
I
you're
was just going to add in as an addendum there, David, that just in case everyone's wondering, these clonal propagules are planted in the field 18 inches apart. So you can see how dense these can form when they're planted that close together. Of course, if we plant them more like 2 to 3 feet apart, then you would see the individual plants, which would be a hemisphere in shape. So either type of planting is fine, but you can actually make this ornamental hedge if they're planted closer than 2 feet apart.
Yeah, that's a good point. And you can see in other parts of the nursery, there's a lot more separation in plants that just don't have this type of vigorous growth. So yeah, this was definitely a standout line for us over the last year.
Right.
And I think it's on to Hannah for her updates on vase life.
Hannah.
Hi, I'm Hannah. I've started doing some new face life studies. So I went out to our Rosemount site and selected some plants, different genotypes. Most of them, surprisingly, were oilseed, mostly looking for plants that had very long stems and very little branching until you get to the very end. And I'm doing treatments with DI water and floral preservative like David did, and then we also added tap water and floral preservative. This is just to mimic what a consumer would most likely be using in their home. And that's currently happening. We're coming up on our first week of that experiment. So hopefully I will have results for you guys soon.
And okay, well, I can close on this. And then I was just looking at some of the chat questions that have popped up. So those are related to what I was talking about. I'll answer those now. So this slide was just showing some of our public outreach efforts that we've been doing this year. We've had a couple blog posts that we've written, so you can, I'm sure we'll share this presentation. If you want to give those a read, you can follow those at the links below. But to get to these questions that were posted in the chat, the age of the plots shown in that main nursery picture, I believe this question came in at the beginning when I was giving an overview of the nursery. And those would have been year 2 plants. So that's definitely, it definitely looked a lot more filled out and vigorous than the year 1 planting did. For those of you who might remember our presentations last year. But yeah, like I said, year 1 vigor is one of the main objectives that we were working on. To answer the second question about vase life studies, common practices like changing water and trimming the stems. Yes, we definitely tried to set this up in as standardized of a study as possible. There seems to be a little bit of disagreement in the vase life research community about exactly what constitutes standard practices, but in our case, this meant trimming the stems to a uniform length and changing the water weekly. So hopefully that answers your question. And then the last question about seed oil content. We have not looked at seed oil content yet. I believe there was a study, somebody looked at this years ago before I started. It's something that we really hope to look at and get running in the future. It would be a collaboration with some sort of food science lab, or at least have a lab that we could send some samples to get a oil analysis. We could see it definitely being an issue with flax, at least in terms of oil content, since the seeds just aren't nearly as big as annual flax. So hopefully that answers your questions. Feel free to ask more in the chat and we can get to those at the end.
These are just some examples of some of the blogs and communications that David's been doing. And of course, Hannah, we'll look forward to having her do a lot of those kinds of things too, that get just some information and discussions out connected with perennial flax as being an organic food source or a good oilseed source or an ornamental. So Kevin is working a lot with us. Of course, he's kind of our weed control expert. And so he's, for a couple of years, been working on herbicides that are suitable for perennial flax. And of course, Don, you can chip in here as you choose, because Kevin is out in the field. And so we're just kind of doing concurrent with our selection for oilseed types that are perennial, screening for potential herbicides for weed management. And so one of the objectives is just generating some baseline data that can be used in IR4 labeling of products. And so he's testing a lot of the herbicides that have been registered for use with the annual flax for oilseed production. So here's just some of the types of chemicals that he's looking at from a pre-emergent, post-emergent category. So a host of different types. And some of you, of course, may be more familiar than others with those. But those are just some examples of the various compounds. And so he's been using APAR as the test variety, oilseed variety, seeding it in at 10 pounds an acre. And this particular test this year was a spring planting. And then the various treatments that come along would be the application of herbicide at various times. And this lists here the various timing of applications for the herbicides. And it should be noted that we were planning on doing a corollary test for organic production methods of cover crops or various other types of things to plant in with them. Our cooperators up in North Dakota, Brent and his team, are doing a lot of work with that, and we'll be pairing up with them, I think, next year to do more work on that. But they have some experience with that, and so we're trying to develop basically a two-pronged approach for oilseed production of perennial flax, such that if you're a conventional farmer, you could be using standard herbicide applications, depending upon what your weed pressure is. And if you're an organic grower, then you could be using some approved organic methods, such as a cover crop, for instance. And so here's a picture from some of Kevin's results later in the summer. Early on, it's always a bit hard during the establishment phase to see the flax because they're so small. And of course, when they get up towards flowering stage, then at least they have somewhat sufficient vigor, than a little bit of shading capacity that they can start to minimize the weed pressures a bit. But without the application of herbicides, you wouldn't see much of these flax at all. So they're definitely intensive when it comes to using herbicides. So here's just an example of the various types of treatment rates that he applied for this weed control study, and the rates and timings that he had. And you can see there's differences in the vigor of the flax. In most cases, it was fairly good, but there were a few, like with Spartan Charge and Dual 2 Magnum, where it was ranked as less than that. And you can see the stand establishment per linear feet was quite a bit lower with some of these that were ranked as the fair. And then the height ranges, basically between 11 up to almost 20. So there's not too much of a significant effect on plant height from the herbicide treatments. And you can see that the hand-weeded check there at the bottom was actually shorter than a couple cases with the application of Prowl. Although whether that's significant enough to have any effect on yield is a good question, but it could be even an inch or two could be enough to raise the level of the flax above the weeds to get greater photosynthetic and yield. So here's just some examples. These are from late July. So you have the control on the upper left-hand side here, and you can see, if you look hard enough, you can see the rows where the flax are, very fine leaves, and then of course the intense weed pressure that surrounds it. So the weeds are very good at taking over. And then with the application of various other herbicides, you can see it's very clear to see where the flax are, as well as the difference in vigor, as well as even flowering in midsummer. So definitely herbicides can be quite effective. They work well on the annual flax, and they seem to work quite well on apar as well as a perennial. And then looking at post-emergent herbicides, so here's the range of types that Kevin has been working with, and you can see, again, a range of fair versus good tolerance of the flax to the herbicides. So there's some obviously that are good enough that could warrant actual use on it. And then the heights overall are a little bit shorter than with the pre-emergence, but up to 16 to 17 inches, just a couple inches difference from the previous study. And then here's what those look like, and you can see the relative effectiveness of these and other plants that come in that the herbicides aren't able to touch, which is always a case. And with hand weeding, of course, these have such fine root systems. The plants are so small. It's really easy with hand weeding to remove some of the flax, and so you end up with these gaps occurring, which you don't see as much with some of the post-emergent herbicides, such as Accent in the lower right. It looks less gappy. So in summary from Kevin's work, he's looked at several herbicides, pre and post emergence, various times of planting, spring and fall are planting options for perennial flax. And there's definitely some that, while not being labeled for, none of them being labeled for perennial flax, certainly could work well, even though some of them may not even be labeled for annual flax. So, so he'll be looking at the second year productivity next year and what the influence of herbicide applications might have on seed yield as well as winter survival, and then how that's going to tailor what our path forward is for stand establishment in perennial oilseed flax.
Let me just say one thing about the herbicide work and,
yes,
and more generally across all of the forevergreen crops. Virtually, we have to work with IR4, which is an interregional federal program that works on the registration of pesticides for crops that are planted on small acreages. So they are basically the intermediate between those that are desiring registration for these pesticides and the industry, right? In other words, the industry isn't going to put up the funds to develop these herbicides for really small acreage crops. But this is the problem. If the company does not agree to take on the liability, no matter how much research you've done and the data that you've collected, if the company will not take on that liability, the label doesn't happen. In other words, it doesn't get it approved. So the group that makes the final decision is the company that controls the label on that specific pesticide. So it's a real convoluted long-term process to get any of these herbicides and other pesticides cleared for these new crops. So this is something that's going on behind the scenes on all of the forever green crops. It just takes a tremendous amount of effort. So we're doing it with Kernza, pennycress, camelina, now flax, as well as hazelnuts, and all of these crops have to go through this process. Something we don't talk about an awful lot, but it's one of those areas of investment that's going on kind of behind the scenes.
Could I do not want to like sidetrack or derail the conversation, but I have a question about that process. Would now be a good time or later to ask that?
Now's a good time.
So I just have two questions. One is if none of the chemicals get approved through this IR4 process, that means that the crop is still, like, could be organically grown or grown without chemical inputs.
That's correct.
Is that right?
That's right.
And then my second question is, how do, in this convoluted process you were describing, how do these approval entities take the data that we're collecting?
Well, IR4 works for the companies and they give us the protocols.
And then we test them and we look at the damage ratings. Yeah, I was out looking at our Kernza plots the other day. So we go out, we collect, like we take ratings on the whatever damage or
visual damage all the way to seed yield.
Right. And then that company then gets fed, and then that information and data then gets fed back to these.
That goes to IR4, and then the package is presented to the chemical company. The chemical company then decides whether they want to take that liability or not.
Okay.
They don't.
So the company then would say, yes, you can use our chemical for perennial flax.
Yes.
Or Kernza.
In other words, they assume that liability.
Right.
And that's been the real big issue with all this, is the fact that the residue problem, particularly as we think about moving the systems into human and animal consumption. And that's the issue. A lot of these herbicides we know work quite well in these systems, but no company took liability on the fact that they are going to say, well, you have to wait 280 days or 300 days so that the residue clears. And so that's been our real struggle with it. IR4 is just an organization to provide the framework. And I believe there's funding to IR4 to be able to handle the residue analyses and the large, the entry analysis that we're doing at multiple states.
But the case though is early on, when you start this work, you always try to get herbicides evaluated on your new crop that are already cleared in a closely genetically related crop, right?
Agreed.
So for Kernza, what's the sister crop? It's wheat, right? So Kernza is from a residue perspective, is being treated like wheat.
Right.
So residue studies will not be done for the herbicides that are being cleared for wheat. They will basically make projections off of the residue studies that have been done on wheat. And that would be the same thing with pennycress and camelina. Herbicides that are already cleared on canola, the odds are much higher of getting them cleared because you don't have to do the residue studies.
And
so
then it's
in the same case here with perennial flax. A number of the herbicides that Kevin is evaluating are not cleared on annual flax. So that would mean that the residue studies would have to be done, and that's where the cost comes into play. And that's where some of your tax dollars coming into IR4 would then support doing that residue work. And that residue work is done at Michigan State at the Pesticide Research Center.
And they might not be willing to
it's
take the
accompanied
risk
by
if something hasn't been already labeled and approved under
Well,
annual flax.
right now we're right in the middle of one of those as an example. Metulachlor is being evaluated on camelina and pennycress. Well, they're not cleared on canola. That means residue studies have to be done. And IR4 has committed to do that. All right.
So Don,
always make a lot of
put together.
Wheat to kernza is not. That seems like not. That seems a bit too apples to oranges.
Yeah, they can still deny it because, well, you know, it's logical, though, right? They are they assume that liability if it goes on their label.
Yeah, yeah. And then it goes company by company. So each company
by company. BASF basically says no to all of them. So things are handled by BASF. They're basically off the chart.
Don, aren't there some herbicides cleared for annual flax though?
That's correct. There are. And they're included in his studies, right?
Yeah,
but he has a lot of other ones that are there. But there aren't an awful lot of herbicides cleared for annual flax.
Okay.
But there are some, sure.
Cool. Thank you.
And there was a question posted in the chat about can you also use tilling along with hand pulling for weed control? And the answer to that is yes, provided of course the plants aren't getting too big and they're not overlapping in between the rows so that you till them under. So that does work. We use tilling in some of our fields along with pre-emergent herbicide on occasion. So, and then Marla posted a note in there about pollinator activity. So our forage hill field happens to be right up the hill behind all of Marla's hives. And we noted last fall, and we're still noting now, honeybees out and actively working the crop. And what was interesting last year was that it stayed in flower after we had several freezes. So a lot of these plants are completely freeze tolerant and stay evergreen during the winter. And so we had flax in flower in November with bee activity on it. And of course, there's nothing else in bloom then. Everything else is dead.
We apologize for turning your honey blue. We're sorry.
Yeah, right. But it will be full of good things. So, you know, you can charge more money for it. So.
Yeah, thank you. It's well, as Frank, as you all know, it's a really win-win when you can give the bees some food at odd times of year like that, or at any time of year, plus increase your yield. So, yeah.
And of course, Marla, if you're interested in doing any studies in our Forage Hill field, we'll have flax there again next year. So just FYI.
Yeah, well, between that and Frank's pennycress, we could probably do some surveys, but it would be helpful to have an undergrad helping you.
Right. So just as a reminder, these are our breeding and genetic collaborators outstate. So of course, Brent, you know, from NDSU, former graduate of Don Wise's group, who's done a lot of work with flax. And he has a couple of grad students that are working with him now. And they've been doing a lot of collecting of Linum louisii and working on the genomics connected with it, but they also have a big herbicide and weed control team there and at MDSU, so we're working with them as well. And then in Colorado, Nolan Kane's group is working along with all of us on bioinformatics and genomics. And so we've sent a lot of leaf samples to them to get them analyzed so they can work on sequencing genomes, et cetera. And we'll parallel that with we'll be generating SNP data on a lot of our materials in this next year. So we'll be tying all of our genetics and genomics works together. And so here's what's kind of underway right now with genome sequencing. And I'm just going to slide through these rather fast because we're almost out of time. But this is what Colorado and North Dakota are working on, particularly with Linum louisii. These are the team of weed scientists and agronomists up in NDSU that are working on the weed control studies. Here's just some pictures of Linum louisii in the wild in Colorado and South Dakota, if you've never seen it growing in the wild. And you can see in its native habitats, it's surrounded by grasses and broadleafs and so forth, and isn't really a very dense population. So, and this is what our fields would look like if we didn't do any weed control. And so they're doing some organic weed control experiments with NC SARE, and this is them planting there on the right side. And this is just to show with Emergence, and so they're using various types of cover grasses, oats in particular, for stand establishment to curtail other types of weeds, and then the oats can die off and the flax can take over. And you can see the flax there amongst the grass cover crop that was planted a few weeks after germination. And they've also done spring versus fall planting using Maple Grove. They get a lot better germination than we did with Maple Grove. A lot of cases ours never even came up, or it had about 1% germination. And so this is the oat that they're using, hull-less oats. And this is just some of their early, you can see the germination of the flax there in those rows there on the right. And as far as our future goals and directions for this next year, we have a grant from the USDA Germplasm Resources Information Network and the Crop Germplasm Committee to evaluate all of the flax accessions in GRIN, with the exception of the annual flax. And so we're going to collect all the descriptors for GRIN, as well as, of course, collect leaves to do SNP markers, and correlate all that with the data that we have, so that we can see if there's additional sorts of germplasm that might be of interest for our perennial flax breeding program. But this will kind of leave a long-term mark in GRIN, thanks to our dedicated work this next year connected with that. And here's our breeding and genetic objectives that we have on just kind of advancing everything. And David's pretty much gone through most of this. Hannah and David will be doing a lot of interspecific backcrossing. And in particular, we want our SNP data to be able to analyze or clarify what species or species backgrounds are in all the accessions that we have. Because David had referenced the fact that there were some definite mix-ups. There certainly was with APAR, and that's true of a lot of the things that we have. And so we need to actually be able to do that. And of course, we'll have these advanced selection trials going in, the All-America selections, et cetera. We hope to get these out to commercial growers. We're going to get our cut flower types to some commercial greenhouse growers to get some data there before we try to test it internationally in the cut flower market. And we hope to do additional 2-3 species crosses with our perennial species that we have and see if they're cross-compatible. We'll try to do some congruity backcrossing to see if we can break up any linkage groups that show up. And of course, we're still interested in the annual to generate new color. And we're going to be doing SNPs with through DART-seq, which has been really successful for us in other crops that we work with. So we'll be able to hopefully identify some SNPs that might be linked to particular traits that we have. And of course, tying that in with any of the genome sequencing that occurs in Colorado. And of course, this will all help us with identifying hybrids and mislabeled species in the germplasm. So that's kind of what we have for you today. I think we've answered most of your questions, but if not, ask them now, or we'll try to answer them online. But I think David's answered the rest of them. So any questions? I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it very much. And you can see this team is expanding, and it's exciting for me to see the collaboration that's being developed across agencies and across universities. And I think this is a program that will deliver some real interesting scientific and commercial results over the next number of years. So Neil and David, thanks very much. Appreciate it.
It's a fun crop.